Shalom, Dr. Dina Dye here with Foundations in Torah. Welcome to this week's 10-minute Torah portion on Noah. We're going to focus in on the vineyard because the vineyard is actually an idiom for the temple. And again, I'm going to go through this year looking at temple idioms and metaphors and things that point to that. So we know that Noah comes off the ark, and the ark, of course, is a picture of the temple as well, but that's for another time. And the first thing he does is he builds an altar. So we have, again, temple construct here. And then the next thing he does basically is to plant a vineyard. And this is kind of key. Now, what's interesting, there's very little said about him constructing the vineyard, just basically one sentence. And the word that's used in there is also kind of interesting, halal, which means to pierce or wound. So it could say he began to build a vineyard, but it could also say that Noah wounded or polluted himself or defiled himself, and then he planted a vineyard. So it could be either one. So the idea here is, of course, we go from there. He plants the vineyard. Now, a long period of time takes place in between because it can take upwards of 10 years to harvest the vintage and to drink the wine. So it tells us that he drank the wine and he became drunk, and then he revealed himself within his tent, and his son Ham saw his nakedness and didn't do anything, and then the other two sons, Shem and Japhet, come in and they cover his nakedness. So it's clear he's in a state of shame. He's brought shame upon himself. He's now in a lower level of sanctity. And the word that's used for his nakedness there is really the same word we have with Adam and Chava, who are in that same state of shame and nakedness when they sin and eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So it's clear to me that Noah, in spite of everything, that the earth has been immersed and cleansed, and kind of a new day dawns and a sort of new nirvana comes, that it's still in a state of decay, that the creation is still collapsing, it is still in a state of decay. And so the curse remains on the earth even though it has been cleansed. So Noah, in a sense, in his body is still in a state of shame, and that the curse could only be removed by the Messiah, Yeshua the Messiah. And so anyone in this, even with the earth having been cleansed, anyone could be degraded and contaminated by that, and only Messiah could overcome that curse and that shame. Now we know from the line of Ham, this produces Nimrod, who is the mighty hunter, and he is the one who ensnares mankind and becomes the king over Babylon. So that line, Ham, by not honoring his father, his line becomes even more diminished. Now there's something from the Ugaritic tale from the ancient Sumerians. It's called the Tale of Akkad. And it tells of a dutiful son who will become his father's heir, and he'll help his father when his father needs help. And the quote here is that the son will hold his hand when he is drunk and support him when he is full of wine. It's kind of interesting that we have that even in the Sumerian records. So we know that Shem and Japhet performed their filial duty towards their father, and that they gain dominance, if you will, over Ham. Now let's jump forward a little bit, and I want to read a verse that I know you're pretty familiar with in Isaiah 5. It says, I want to sing a song for someone I love, a song about my loved one and his vineyard. He dug up its stones, he cleared them away, he planted it with choicest vines, and he built a watchtower in the middle of it, and carved out in its rock a wine press. So typically the wine press would be carved out of rock and be constructed at the bottom of the mountain. So this is again Isaiah 51, 1 and 2. The tower here is actually an idiom for the Holy of Holies, and the vineyard itself is a picture or metaphor for the temple complex. And so what's being spoken of God the Father, who's singing a song for the one he loved, that is Israel. But also Israel, we know, is an overlay of the bride, which is also a pattern of the temple. So the temple is something living. It is the bride, and it's pictured as Israel. And so he's singing a song about the one he loved, and he is building this vineyard. And so we see that God himself is the one who builds the vineyard. Typically, in the ancient times, farmers did not build their own vineyards. They would inherit them from their fathers. And so we're seeing here, most farmers did not start their own vineyards in that regard. So we see God as the farmer, if you will, or the vintner, and he is the one who constructs the vineyard. Now, in this verse here in Isaiah 5, we see that God has selected the site, he has cleared the stones, and he has built all the installations that go with the vineyard. So again, he's the vintner, the people are his vineyard, seen as living stones or as a living bride, as the temple, the body. And then in this context, God cares for his people and he loves his people. So Isaiah is describing the city, Jerusalem, and the temple, because they're one and the same, as the Lord's vineyard that has been carefully planted and carefully tended. So in the same way, we have Noah actually building a vineyard because everything's been wiped off the face of the earth. But to me, he's building it in the pattern and plan of his forefathers. So he didn't just come up with something and build a vineyard. He was renewing a vineyard that had already been there before. And vineyards, of course, are in a constant state of renewal. And again, this is temple imagery of something being built, destroyed, rebuilt, all the way through Scripture. So it is generally the father of the house, or if we were speaking of the temple, the leadership would be the one that would build up the vineyard or build up the temple. Again, we have temple imagery here. Of course, the vineyard would have been constructed in the garden. The garden grew all kinds of fruit trees and all kinds of grain. And we would have the libation ceremonies would come forth from that. So from the vineyard would come the libation offerings, and from the granaries would come forth all the mincha or the grain offerings. So again, Noah building the vineyard is very much temple language. In terms of wine production in ancient Mesopotamia, this was always reserved for the royal domain, if you will. So it was kings and monarchs that would be responsible for the vineyard. Interesting, the land of Israel is one of the best places to have a vineyard because of the very hot summers. So grapes would thrive in the hot summers, and then they would benefit from the nights, the dew that would come at the nights. We see the same thing here in New Mexico. We have some excellent vineyards. In fact, less than a mile from my house is a vineyard with probably 10,000 plants. And again, because of the dry summers and the dew that we get at night. And of course, the dew enhances the grapes as they mature through the summer months. So the climate and topography of Israel was very conducive for the cultivation of the vine. Now, we go back, Noah gets drunk, he brings dishonor to himself. And there is a principle kind of in the Bible, in the scriptures, in the ancient world, that too much wine would lead to moral blindness. Really, this is all a pattern and picture of what would come in the second temple. We think perhaps Isaiah 5 could have been written from the time of the Babylonian exile. I'm not sure on that. But it was the leaders of the second temple that were the ones that were morally blind. And so this description, what we have in Isaiah 5, is actually an allegory for the leadership in the second temple. And we see a metaphor come for the divine judgment. Isaiah 5, of course, leads into Isaiah 6, which is a picture of the future temple, but it is in terms of the first temple. The first temple was seen as the bride. The second temple was seen as the harlot, the one that had polluted her and defiled herself. So we read in Isaiah 5, it talks about, woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine, who acquit the guilty of bribes and deny justice to the righteous. And this is what was going on in the second temple with the leadership. Bribery, graft, etc., and they were basically denying justice to the oppressed and to those that were poor, etc., etc. So God begins to compare his judgment then on the harvest or on the grapes. And so the vineyard has wonderful imagery all through the Bible. Another one you might be familiar with, of course, is in the Song of Songs. This is an allegory as well of the temple as a bride, the pure temple. That would be the first temple. And it talks about in the Eshet Hayil, the woman of valor. She is one who actually owns a vineyard. So we see that as well. So all of this is speaking of the relationship between God and his bride, and that, of course, is Israel, and is an overlay with the temple. Now, when we jump into Revelation, we see this really brought forth. So Yahweh, or God, is trodden down the winepress, and it speaks in Isaiah 5 of him, the virgin daughter of Judah, being thrown into the winepress and crushed. So out of Judah comes forth the leadership for the temple. And the idea of the destruction of temple has to do with the admonishing of the priests in that time, talking about producing sour grapes, again referring to the second temple and the city of Jerusalem. So it talks about judging between me and my vineyard, that is my house, and the vineyard is the house of Israel once again, where God expected justice, but there was only bloodshed. And so he removed the hedge that was around the vineyard. And so here again, he's dealing with the priests. Now, I want to quickly mention about a festival that takes place. It's 50 days after Shavuot. We find this in the Qumran temple scroll. And it's not a festival in the Tanakh, but it talks about the offering of the new wine that would take place early in the month of Av. And of course, the month of Av is significant because on the 9th of Av, that's when both temples were destroyed. And so this particular festival has to do with that. And it says in there that the seer linked the festival of the wine to the final judgment of the temple. So there was a relationship. We again jump ahead into Revelation. We see the great winepress of the wrath of God. And we see the gathering and the trampling of the grapes associated with the day of the Lord. Now, Yeshua will just quickly close out here. He mentions, of course, in his parable of the vineyard, we can read that in Mark 12:9, that the Lord waited for the vintage, but obtained nothing. And so now what will the owner of the vineyard do? And it says he will come and he destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. And so those tenants were the leaders of the temple at the second temple period. And we know at this particular time, Yeshua left the temple in Matthew 24, and he prophesied that all the temple buildings would be destroyed. Revelation 14 talks about the one like the Son of Man, because we have this imagery of the temple in heaven, and he would emerge with the angels from the temple, and he would be seated on a white cloud, and he would be wearing the golden crown, but he would be carrying the sickle of the harvest. And other angels would gather as well. They would gather up the grapes to trample the winepress. There would be one particular angel in charge of the fire, and that angel would gather the cluster of grapes from the earth's vine because the grapes were ready, they were ripe, and they would be thrown into the winepress of God's fury. Very graphic imagery of the destruction of the temple. So the winepress would be trodden outside the city, and the blood would flow as high as a horse's bridle for 200 miles. So it's likely that the book of Revelation was in fact written before this destruction of the second temple. And so it was when the city fell in 70 Common Era, the prophecy that we saw back in Isaiah 5 and the prophecy here in Revelation was fulfilled. Of course, we know that Yeshua tells us in John 15 that he is the vine and that his Father is the vine dresser or the vintner. And apart from him, we cannot bear any fruit. That we are the branches and we must stay united in him to bear fruit, to create that glorious vineyard, because we are all connected one to another and we are all, in a sense, the vineyard. And so if you see here that this destruction and this judgment comes down on the leadership of Israel at the time of the Second Temple. And so we must be very careful as we serve him. And certainly if we are leaders in the movement, certainly in the Hebrew Roots movement, Messianic movement, et cetera, that God will judge the leaders because of the oppression and how the leaders violate the people, the sheep. So any of you serving in positions of leadership and authority need to carefully examine your heart every day and stay connected to the vine so that you can produce fruit and so that you can minister and lead others and return to him. I think that's the message going forward of the story in Noah. See you next time. Shalom.